All right, time for Chapter 9. So Chapter 9 is all on joints. Let's go to our first slide. So a joint is also called an articulation. That's the point where two bones meet. It doesn't matter whether or not that joint is movable. It's just where those two different joints meet. Your two different bones meet. The name for the joint is made from the bones that are involved in the joint. So you're able to separate out, figure out where that joint is just based on the bones that are part of the name of that joint. And joints are classified by how they're bound to each other. First type of joint is a bony joint. So this is an immobile joint where two bones meet and bone helps to fuse them together. So for example, in the frontal bone where you have the joining of that bone as the baby's head goes from lots of empty spaces and then fusing together to form your different form your joints. Another example is the left and right mandibular bones. So during development, the mandible or lower jawbone is in two pieces, but as the child grows and eventually in an adult, that mandible fuses into one bone. Other places where there's bone fusion, so in the elderly, the sutures that are on your skull, separating out and showing where our different bones are, become fused together in the elderly. And then lastly, same thing with the elderly, fusing together of the sternum and the first rib. So this joint here, they will eventually fuse together in an elder adult. Next type of joint is a fibrous joint. So the connector between a fibrous joint is collagen fibers. So there's three kinds of fibrous joints. You have your sutures, like the ones that are inside your skull, as well as gumphoses and syndesmoses. So for your fibrous joints, again, your sutures in the skull, as your fibrous joints fuse together, for your suture, it's actually serrated, so in a kind of a zigzag pattern. You can also have a lap suture where it overlaps, like in the squamous suture on the skull, or in a plain suture where they're just straight across. So, for example, the palatine process of the maxilla has that plain suture, so just a straight flat suture. A gomphosis fibrous joint, so that helps to keep our tooth in the socket, but gives it a little bit of movement so that your teeth can wiggle around when you're eating, so you're not like putting unnecessary pressure on them, so they give a little bit of give. The last type of fibrous joint is syndesmosis. So longer collagen fibers between the radius and ulna, as well as the tibia and fibula. So these allow for, oh well, he won't do it. Nope, okay. So these allow for these bones to rotate around each other, so allowing you to have that twisted motion for your arm and a little bit on your lower leg, more so for your forearm region. Next type of joint is the cartilaginous joints. So the two bones are linked by cartilage, and there's two types of cartilaginous joints. You have your synchondrosis as well as your symphysis. So for your synchondrosis, the bones are joined by hyaline cartilage. So for example, in the epiphyseal plates that are in the long bones as they're still growing, as well as the first rib attachment to the sternum, until you get to a elderly person and this bone, this joint fuses together as bone. Next type of cartilaginous joint is symphysis. So this is a different type of cartilage. It's fibrocartilage. So found in between your os coxa bones. So this pubic symphysis here where the two bones meet. Also, the bodies of your vertebrae are joined by discs that are also fibrocartilage. So nice strong cartilage giving you support for your spine. The last type of joint is so special that it gets its own section for the chapter, and that's a synovial joint. So synovial joint is separated by a joint cavity, and so there's multiple parts to it. It's the most familiar type of joint, very, very mobile, and you'll see why due to that joint cavity. Very complex, again, due to that joint cavity. So a lot of different actors to play a role to allow those joints to move freely. It's the most important joint for a lot of health and fitness type of professions. So here's the general structure of a synovial joint, the example given being one of our knuckle joints in the finger, so this is kind of blown up. For those that are in my on-campus class, your labeling will come from this picture. So for our synovial joint, in the directly middle portion of this joint is our synovial fluid. So there's these fibroblast-like cells that make the synovial fluid. So that's this little empty space in here. That helps those two bones just glide across each other and helps to reduce friction. This fluid is kept in that area by the joint capsule, which is made of the synovial membrane as well as the fibrous capsule on the outside. Also, parts of the synovial joint, you still have your articular cartilages at the joint surfaces on both bones. And then still having the ligaments helping to connect bone to bone. So bone to bone connecting them together. So all this other stuff is on the inside, providing a nice slick surface. So your synovial fluid acting like a lubricant to make everything nice and slippery. So here's the text version of what I just said. Articular cartilage at the joint surface, that's your hyaline cartilage. The joint cavity helps to separate these articular surfaces, so it gives it more space. Filled with our synovial fluid, which is our lubricant. Keeps everything nice and slippery, keeps your motion from having friction as the joints move. On the inside of our joint capsule, also called the articular capsule. So again, the cells that make the synovial fluid are a fibroblast-like cell. So just like your fibroblast builder cells in your connective tissue, this type of cell is making the kind of supportive structure for this area. For a few of your joints, some of the fibrocartilage grows inward to form a disc. So this disc helps to give extra shape and cushion for the bones. Some either go all the way across the joint capsule in the temporomandibular joint, so that's your jaw joint. Can't see him. So right here, that joint there has an extra disc that helps to separate the joint cavity, as well as in the meniscus in the knee. So giving that extra support for that joint as you're putting all that pressure on your knee region. Also helps with the fit of the bones as they fit together for that joint, as well as stabilize the joint. So it kind of provides like a little cup to hold the femur and help to keep everything nice and stable. Accessory structures for our joints are, you have your tendons that connect muscle to bone. Sometimes in certain joints that also help to stabilize the joint. Ligaments, again, bone to bone, and helping to cushion the joints. So in a lot of the joints, because of the high level of movement, you have a bunch of soft tissue like your skin and muscles that would rub against that joint. So there's two types of cushions. You have a bursa, which helps to cushion, and then a tendon sheath, which wraps around tendons, which is very similar to the bursa and is found in the hand and foot. And again, keeping the skin and other soft tissues from rubbing against the joint during movement. There are 6 classes of synovial joints, and they're based on their movement and shape. So the first one, and one type that has the widest range of movement of all the synovial joints, is the ball and socket joint. So you have a ball and socket joint in your shoulder joint. So this is actually the humeroscapular joint. So between the humerus and the scapula in the shoulder. So the ball is on the head of the humerus, and then the socket is the glenoid cavity made with the scapula. So this is actually your joint that has the widest range of movement because it's very shallow and allows for a lot of movement in that area. So a lot of free range, and it's kind of loose. So it allows for those bones and muscles and everything to have the freedom and space to move around. Let's see, going down, go on the side. So the next type is a pivot joint, and that's between the radius and ulna. So it's the radio-ulnar joint. So as your arm twists, these two bones, which are in your forearm, are able to glide around each other, and therefore giving the forearm the twist motion. Also in this region is the humeral-ulnar joint. So between the humerus and the ulnar bone, this is a hinge joint. So it has one direction for its movement, so it only goes a back and forth type of movement. So both your humeral ulnar joint and your radial ulnar joint make up your elbow, and your elbow is a location in your body that's two joints in roughly the same location. Moving further down your hand in the carpal region, you have a plane joint called the intercarpal joint. So these little small bones that are inside the wrist area of your hands, they slide against each other. So like a flat plane sliding against each other. Moving a little bit further in the hand, you have a saddle joint. And this is between the trapezius, so one of your carpals. The names for one of that one. Don't have to know it for that for the exam, but I'm just saying. So between the trapezius and this metacarpal in your thumb. So this joint is kind of like two saddles sitting on top of each other. So here's one saddle, here's the other saddle, and the cup of them allows them for going in multiple directions. Last type of joint is a condylar joint, and this is between the metacarpal bones and the phalanges. So you have one that's more of like a football shape, kind of more rounded, and then the other part for one of the phalanx or phalange bones is more like a cup that sits in, that holds the joint from the metacarpal. So this also is a biaxial joint, only going in two directions. On the study guide, I asked you to know examples of plane or gliding joints, so I just wanted to point those out. So again, your plane joints are on a flat surface. They're usually biaxial, so they only move in two different directions, so a side to side and a back and forth. So examples of this are the carpal bones in the wrist, the tarsal bones of the ankle, the articular processes of your vertebrae, so sliding against each other. The ribs 2 through 7 will slide as they're making contact with the vertebrae. To the sternum, so in the front of the chest. And then lastly, the sacroiliac joint. So here we have our sacrum, and then with the iliac portion of the os coxa. Also in the study guide, I tell you to know the specifics on the selected diathroses. So these are selected synovial joints, or selected joints that have kind of a little bit more special than some of your other joints. So the first one is the temporomandibular joint, made from the condyle of the mandible, so down here, as well as the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. So this is a synovial joint. And its synovial joint is special because there's an articular disc that runs through the middle of it. So it divides that synovial joint into having a superior and inferior chamber. Still having all your other parts for your synovial joint, except for there's this extra articular disc running through the middle of it. So it still gives the joint that glide and able to move as you're talking, eating, whatever, but still gives a little bit more structure and support. The next special joint is the glenohumeral joint, also known as the humeroscapular joint. So it's where the humerus articulates with the scapular, or you can say the humerus articulates into the glenoid cavity. So the glenoid cavity is a part of the joint capsule that helps to create some of that loose shoulder movement, giving it the widest range of movement of any of your joints. The shoulder is also supported by different tendons and to help give it that structure and support. So from the biceps brachii muscle, that tendon in the front helps to support your shoulder, as well as your rotator cuff tendons. Now, you don't have to know that for this class, but eventually somewhere along the line in your professional career, you actually have to know what those tendons are and their names. So the rotator cuff tendons are the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. So one way to easily remember that one is SITS, S-I-T-S. So here is the humerus being supported into the glenoid cavity for the shoulder joint. Again, having our supportive tendons for this. So from the biceps brachii region. And in this anterior view, you can only see the subscapularis tendon, so beneath the scapula tendon, so wrapping around here, as well as the supraspinatus tendon, which will which is, if you could see the back of your scapula, seeing that it's above your spine on your scapula. The next special joint is in the elbow region. So it's a hinge joint that includes two articulations or two joints. So that's between the humerus and the upper arm or more superior region and the ulnar, as well as the humerus to the radial region. All of this is enclosed into one joint capsule. So still having that synovial fluid in that area, still having the fibrous capsule helping to keep the synovial fluid in place. And of course, all the supporting ligaments and tendons and whatnot. Still gives that joint lots of free movement in that region. So elbow joint is a hinge with two articulations or two joints in one. Okay, next is the hip joint. So the hip joint is also called the coxal joint, because of the os coxa that is involved with making that joint. So the coxal joint or the hip joint is also a ball and socket joint like your humeroscapular joint or the one that's your shoulder, except for with your hip joint being at the lower regions of the body and having to hold more weight. The sockets for the hip joints are deeper and therefore more stable than the shoulder, and it's not as loose as the shoulder, so you're not going to have as much of movement in the coxal or hip joint as you would in your shoulder region. So for this joint, made by the head of the femur, that's your ball, and the acetabulum, which is your socket in the os coxa. One thing that's special about the hip joint is the way that the ligaments attaching the femur to our os coxa help to stabilize this joint. So when you stand up, those ligaments twist. And as they twist, they help to hold the head of the femur deeper into the acetabulum socket of the hip of the os coxa. So the three ligaments that are involved all bind to different portions of your os coxa. So the first one, pubofemoral, so between the femur and the pubis of your os coxa. Iliofemoral, between the femur and your ilium. And then the ischiofemoral, between the femur and your ischium of your os coxa. So each three of those portions helping to stabilize the hip joint. Moving on to the knee. So your knee joint is also called your tibiofemoral joint between the femur and your tibia. It's the largest and most complex of your joints. So again, being even lower on the body, needing help with bearing all the weight that is on your body. Primarily, your knee joint is a hinge joint. There is one more joint in that region, the patellofemoral joint, which is a gliding joint between the femur and your little tiny patella kneecap that's in the front. For the knee joint, the joint capsule only encloses the lateral or side portions and back parts of the knee. The anterior or front portion is covered by the patellar ligament. These are parts of the tendons from the quadriceps femoris muscle, so our big quad muscle that goes over the thigh region. So to help stabilize this joint, there's multiple ways to do so. Again, you have your quadriceps tendon from that muscle in the front of your knee going across that anterior surface. Then you have the tendon of the submembraneous muscle on the back part of your knee. And then you have your lateral and medial meniscus. So this is a type of fibrocartilage that grows into our knee joint. And that helps to hold the parts of the bottom condyle portions of your femur into that socket, so provides like a little cup for that bone and helps to stabilize the knee. Also, it's extra padding to absorb shock. And this is also another C-shaped cartilage, so there's a little bit of joining of the little C-shaped cartilage by the transverse ligament. So it gives it a little bit of stretch and movement as you're using your knee to move around. Next special joint is the talocrural joint, also known as the ankle joint. So one of your larger tarsal bones that's in your foot is called the talus, and this is where you are creating your ankle joint. Excuse me. So there's also two articulations in this joint. The medial joint, so the one towards the midline of the body between the tibia and the talus bone. The one on the lateral on the outside is your fibula, so the little tiny bone that kind of works like a cane on the outside to stabilize the ankle. So that malleoli of both of them extending over the talus bone to create this joint. This is also enclosed in one joint capsule. So a lot of synovial fluid helping keep your ankles all nice and friction-free as they move around. And again, the malleoli of the fibula and tibula help to prevent side-to-side rocking of your ankle. Last little bit of the ankle that I'm going to mention is a very important ligament. Well, not ligament, but tendon for not only keeping the ankle stable, but also very important for walking. That's this one at the bottom called the calcaneal or Achilles tendon. The word Achilles comes from a character in either Greek or Roman mythology that was their weak point on their body. They're like indestructible except for that point. So this tendon extends from the calcaneus bone. So the calcaneal bone here, or calcaneus bone, so your big heel bone in the back of your foot, extending up into your calf muscles at the back of your leg. So that one's actually definitely important. You actually need to know that one for the muscle exam, definitely. So I'm actually going to move on to chapter 10, really focusing on 10.1 because that's the only part on this for this exam. The rest of chapter 10 is going to be on the muscle exam, so that will be completely separate. All right, moving on to chapter 10. So for chapter 10 starts off with just naming your muscles. So just getting through all those different organs in your muscular system. So there's 600 human skeletal muscles. Of those 600, of course, you won't have to know all of those for the muscle exam. Just focus on the study materials under laboratory on Blackboard, or if this is old enough, the new system called D2L. So there's about 600 muscles in the human skeleton. They're Of those muscles, there's 3 kinds of muscle tissues. You have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Their job is to convert the chemical energy that's released from breaking that third phosphate group off of an ATP molecule, so the energy that's released there, and turning it into the mechanical energy of motion. So like other organs, there are connective tissue wrappings that help to protect those organs as well as the parts that are inside the organ. So with your muscles, there are actually multiple wrappings around the muscle. So starting around a muscle fiber, also called a muscle cell, down here in our little smallest bit of structure is a endomysium. Then you take a few of your muscle fibers in one group called a fascicle. That fascicle is wrapped in a perimysium. Then take a couple fascicles, put them together into an entire muscle, and that's your epimysium. Then a couple of muscles that work together for a particular function or a particular movement. Those muscles are wrapped in another type of connective tissue called a fascia. The last connective tissue wrapping that helps to not only protect but also keep your different muscle organs from rubbing up against each other is a septa. So these intermuscular septas are a lot thicker than just your regular fascia, and they help to separate your muscle compartments from each other. So you have, like, for example, these different muscle compartments. So here in green is one, the orange one is one, this little blue one is one, and this larger pink on the back of, and this is actually a cut through your lower leg. So these big calf muscles, they're also a muscle group. So each of these is wrapped with fascia, and then they're separated by a thicker type of fascia called a intermuscular septa. So that's it for Chapter 9 and Chapter 10.1. So next one will be Chapter 11.